Hello, my friend, and welcome to the study. It's so good to see you here today. Sometimes we can forget that while it is cold and dark in the Northern Hemisphere winter, it is the height of summer in Australia. So today, let's look at another artist and illustrator, Mae Gibbs, who is famous, among many things, for her gumnut babies. A very imaginative artist, Mae Gibbs grew up in Western Australia. As a child, she spent a lot of time in the bush, and this inspired her to write children's books and illustrate them, starting with her gumnut babies, Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie, which you can see here. In very recognizable late 19th century, early 20th century style. So once again we'll be looking at that fascinating era of art and culture that began with the Biedermeier and Romantic movement and spanned Impressionism, Art Nouveau, and Art Deco. I've got a few of the little things that I have collected over the years from nature. I'm always picking up shells, corals, feathers, stones, barnacles, leaves, nuts, acorns, sea urchins, all manner of things I see in nature, and stashing them all over the house, even sea glass, volcanic rock, anything that's interesting. So like a squirrel, I've stashed these in bowls and boxes and drawers and little nooks and crannies. But alas, I could not find the gum nut that I saved, that I wanted to show you, but not to worry. They'll turn up one of these days and I'll bring them into the study and we can put them in your special box. I wonder if that's what a squirrel feels like when he's stashed something away and can't remember where he's put it. But it does make for quite an adventure when you find something that you'd forgotten about. So there will be some nice sounds of gum leaves and interesting stones and little bits of nature while we look at that iconic Australian illustrator, Mae Gibbs, and find out more about her work and her life. and how it inspired culture and imagination, because I think that despite the disdain Charles Ryder expressed in Brideshead Revisited about artists who went commercial, sacrificed their creativity to make money with advertisements and marketing. All of these things are important to us 100 years later, because you can see how imagination fuels the young minds in children's books, but also shows us what people were thinking and feeling and how they were interacting, and how we can learn from that. So let's have a look at the life of Mae Gibbs. Mae Gibbs became one of Australia's most iconic and treasured artists, with her bush fantasy world that captured the imaginations of children of all ages. She reminisced later in life that everything became alive for me. It was just a fairy tale all the time. Born on the 17th of January, 1877, she was the only daughter, and her father was an artist and cartoonist. The family moved to Australia in 1881 when she was just 4 years old. They lived on farms in Western Australia for a while before settling near Perth. It was during these years that Mae became enchanted with the Australian bush, likely free to wander as a child should, gleaning ideas from her natural surroundings. In an interview, she once said, "I don't know if the bush babies found me or I found the little creatures." She was also supported in her artistic ability, recalling that she could draw before she could walk. Botanical drawings became her forte, and when she was 15 years old, she won her first art prize at the Perth Wildflower Show. In 1900, Mae travelled back to England to begin studying art at Cope and Nichol Art School in London. Extremely industrious, she also took night classes at the Chelsea Polytechnic Institute. There, she would develop life drawing and character sketching. Overworked, however, she became ill and was persuaded to return home to Perth at the end of the next year. Back in Perth, Mae secured commissions for her work with local companies and publications, and even social commentary, publishing her illustrations under the pseudonym Blob for Western Australian magazine Social Kodak. By 1904, Mae was able to return to London to complete her formal training at Mr. Henry Blackburn's School for Black and White Artists, as well as at Chelsea Polytechnic, finishing with first-class honours. It would be the single-line drawing at Blackburn that was to influence the rest of her career. In many ways, May embodied the new woman of the early 20th century, though she would later describe herself as not so much a feminist but an individualist. By 1905, May returned once again to Perth to embark on a successful career as an illustrator for the Western Australian newspaper, the Western Mail. However, one thing was never enough for her, and she found more expression for her creative art in her story, Mimi and the Wog, Their Adventures in Australia, that she published under the pseudonym Sylvia Hood, but it was never published. By November 1909, May had become disillusioned by her stagnant career in Western Australia, and she returned to London, accompanied by her mother, Cissy. May acquired a literary agent, Charles H. Wood, who secured her commissions as an illustrator with leading British publisher George Harrop. At Wood's suggestion, a reworked Mimi and Wog landed her a publishing contract. Her story, About Us, was then published in 1912 in London and New York. May also drew cartoons for newspapers, including the Christian Commonwealth and suffragette publication The Common Cause. It was at this time that May met her lifelong friend, activist, socialist, and suffragette Renee Ames. May overworked herself once again and returned to Perth in 1913, accompanied by Renee. For a time, she contributed to satirical cartoons for the Western Mail until she and Renee decided to move to Sydney. They lived first in a boarding house in Neutral Bay on Sydney's North Shore. From there, she would take the ferry to her studio in Bridge Street and quickly established herself as a talented and in-demand artist and illustrator. She maintained a steady stream of commissions from publishers, including doing book covers for Angus and Robertson and cover illustrations for the literary magazine The Lone Hand and Sydney Mail. It was during her time in Sydney that May discovered the Blue Mountains, a bushland to the west of Sydney, and her imagination was reignited for the bush fairyland of her youth. In 1913, she was commissioned to illustrate Ethel Turner's serial, The Magic Button, in the Sydney Mail. In amongst the detail, one can see a family of gumnuts. In December, May also took out copyright registration for a gum leaf bookmark, which would become one of Australia's most iconic designs ever. In January 1914, the Gumnut Babies, at the time called Gumnut Brownies, made their second appearance, this time on the cover of the January issue of The Lone Hand. The Sydney Mail then commissioned May to do 25 covers, and from here the bush fairies began to come shyly out into the public. At the outbreak of the Great War, May published postcards featuring gumnut creatures and Australian animals that were sent in Red Cross parcels to the Anzac soldiers around the world from their families. World War I had a great impact on Australian identity, Australia having only since 1901 become a federation. When Australians were killed at the Battle of Gallipoli, the nation began to understand itself as one unified Australian identity. And the contributions of Mae Gibbs, images from home of the native flora and fauna, contributed greatly to that identity abroad. Mae, ever hard-working and energetic, also created calendars, pictures, and postcards that, because of high demand, had commercial print runs. Indefatigable, Mae began writing the Gumnut Baby stories that would become classic Australian literature, first published in December 1916. Gum Blossom Baby soon followed. Both books were an immediate sellout and received critical praise. Thus encouraged, she published 3 more Bush Baby books, Boronia Babies, Flannel Flower, and Other Bush Babies in 1917, and Wattle Babies in 1918. The Bush Babies were now firmly established as a part of Australian folklore. By 1918, Mae had become a beloved Australian children's author. Soon, Tales of Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie was published. Immensely popular, it has never been out of print to this day. In this book, Mae also revealed herself to be a committed conservationist. Her opening inscription reading, "Humans, please be kind to all bush creatures, and don't pull up flowers by the roots." In 1919, Mae Gibbs was made a life member of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Here are a few pages from the Gumnut Babies books. I can read the captions to you as you look at the cute little picture. If the sad things happen and baby birds are orphans in the nest, then the nuts take charge and feed and care for them as their own parents would have done. And there you can see Mae Gibbs' signature. In the springtime, when birds are busy with their nests, the little nuts do all they can to help them. They love the baby birds as if they were their own. Now, this is not the first or the last reference or connection of babies with birds, and it's difficult to say where it began, but John Barry had the same idea about little babies and birds and their relation, and wrote about it in Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. Another story that we'll look at in the study. And look, there is an Australian possum. There are so many marsupials in Australia. And these possums, as you see here, are very big and fluffy, unlike the North American possum that's spelled without an O at the beginning, just possum. They're marsupials. Their babies live in pouches, and they sleep so long. They sleep for days. They're very lazy. They eat birds' eggs and anything they find, and they're very slow, very cute with big ears and little whiskers and little tiny little hands. They look very different than the North American possum. And since Mae Gibbs, they're one of the animals associated with babies and infants because they care for their young and they're very cute. It vexes the little nuts that they cannot hang by their tails like baby possums do. It would be so very convenient. It would be. Imagine hanging from your tail and having your hands free, or like a squirrel hanging from your toes. On all the big gum trees there are gumnut babies. Some people see them and some don't, but they see everybody and everything. Possibly that's how their eyes have grown so big. See the chubby little gumnut babies with their gumnut hats and the gum leaves behind them. I don't think we should lose that capacity for imagination that we have as children to see all the magic in nature, because it keeps that part of the mind alive that innovates and stays positive and takes action when it's needed and is not easily defeated by negativity. And here we have another possum, and this one you can see his little hands and claws and his cute little nose and big eyes, big ears, very fluffy and furry. Once, when poor Mrs. Possum lost her only child, one of the little nuts climbed into her pouch and pretended to be her baby. Mrs. Possum was so much comforted until she found her possum baby again. And there we have the little chubby gumnut baby with his little wings and nut hat, holding on to the gum nuts and kissing the little baby possum who's in his mum's pouch. The gum leaves there and the blossoms. This book is by George Adams, called Birdscaping Your Garden: How to Attract Australian Native Birds to Your Garden. Mind you, you have to be in Australia. You're not going to attract them on another continent. But here we can see some of the Australian birds that Mae Gibbs will have seen in the bush. The kookaburra, parrot, and there is a flowering gum, the nut forming, and the gum nuts are not really nuts like the acorns, but the birds, like the parrots, eat the nectar out of these flowers with their little bird tongues. This is a rosella. And the rosella feeds on the fruits of the Grevillea banksii, or the Banks grevillea. And this is that plant again. We'll get some color photographs. There we are. The birds eating the nectar out of the flowers. And because it's so dry in Australia, and this is how the creatures get their fluids. And you can see the very thin leaves. This is a plant that grows in a very arid climate. And there we have another rosella in the tree, an eastern rosella. And these are bottle brush flowers. You can see those. Bottle brush in Western Australia. And here we have the honey flower. And the bird is rightly called the honey eater. This is a Melaleuca flower. Another bird with a beak drinking from that. And a cockatoo, sulphur-crested cockatoo, pecking off the berries with his sharp beak. The waratah, telepea, or braidwood waratah. Beautiful, bright red flowers, all in bloom right now, while we have our cold, dark northern winter. Life is teeming in the southern hemisphere. Ever the whirlwind, May met and married mining agent James O'Soley Kelly, or J.O. as he was known, whilst visiting her parents in Perth in 1919. They returned to Sydney, and J.O. became May's business manager. In 1925, they built a home, Nutcote, in Neutral Bay, where May lived and worked as author and illustrator for the rest of her life. In 1920, May received commission to produce a promotional poster for the New South Wales Department of Public Health for the first ever Baby Week. The resulting artwork, titled Dr. Stork and Mrs. Kookaburra, is one of her most famous and celebrated images. 2 further gumnut books were published, The Story of Nutty Bub and Nittersing in 1923, and 2 little gumnuts, Chucklebud and Wunkydoo, in 1924. The following year, May created the popular comic strip Bib and Bub, Australia's longest-running comic strip, and would also go on to author further books, Scotty in Gumnut Land, Mr. and Mrs. Bear and Friends, and her final book in 1953, Prince Dandelion. The Sunday News expanded their children's supplement to include a column by May titled Gumnut Gossip, extracts from the Daily Bark. The weekly newspaper column ran from 1925 until 1935 and featured short stories and illustrations of life in Gumnut Town with a humorous twist or moral. Not content with only one newspaper, May, under the pseudonym Stan Cotman, published a second cartoon strip featuring the pipe-smoking pig Tiggy Touchwood. In a rival newspaper, the Sunday Sun, as well as with Melbourne's Sunday News Pictorial. From these comic strips, numerous books were published and kept May's unflagging creative muse busy. As with many artists, the Depression took a toll on the sales of May's books, and she was never able to recover financially. J.O. passed away in 1939, after which May busied herself with her work, her beloved Scotty dogs, and her garden at Nutcote. In 1941, both her father and mother passed away, and her close friend Renee in the early 50s. After these losses, May became a virtual recluse. In 1955, May was appointed member of the British Empire in acknowledgement of her important contribution to Australian children's literature. May's sense of fun and clever humour was never lost as she planned the writing of an autobiography to be titled This Other Fairy Tale by Anonymous. It never progressed beyond early notes. However, exhausted, she tossed it aside as a muddle of memories, a huddle of hearsay, a gabble of gossip, a riot of richness. In April 1967, in her 90th year, May completed her last cartoon and retired. On the 27th of November 1969, Mae Gibbs passed away in Sydney at the ripe old age of 92. Let's go to the website of the State Library of New South Wales. Here you can see many of May's illustrations and paintings with her ink and line drawings and explanations about where they were published. And some of them, like this one, the little ragged blossom, you can almost see each little colored pencil stroke. The idea is just flowing from her creativity. And some, like these flying butterflies, more composed with the shadow and light and dark. So many pictures inspired by the Australian bush, and just ideas jotted down. And the gum leaves, the iconic symbol of May's work. And here we go to her artwork in her early life. As you can see, there's a extensive menu here. And here we see how she used to paint the flowers in Western Australia, as well as the people she would see. Some of these are from her days in art school in London. Sketches watercolors. And different perspectives. But I particularly like her flower watercolors and the way she mixes the colors, but also the women. Although just a practice piece, you can see her brushstroke in the watercolor, or the water stroke rather. It's very dashing in her character. And as this loads, we can see some of her imaginative works that remain unpublished. These wonderful sea dragons, native to Australian waters. A fantasy world that May envisioned in the mystique of the Australian bush. And here we see Mimi and Wog the dog, on their adventures in the outback. And to May's commercial art, once again painting a self-portrait here. She certainly captures something in the face of the women, I think. As you can see with her iconic bookmark, she's focusing on the eyes, because that's where true character can be seen, in the eyes. And this lady with her huge hat there, and some more women for the Sydney Mail. And her love of animals and nature, always present. Imagining what the animals would be doing were they more human, what they would be thinking in a magical world, similar to that of Beatrix Potter. And here are her designs for commercial works. The Public Health of New South Wales, Kookaburra and Stork, and of course the Lone Hand illustrations, and how those came together. All the little gumnut babies, flower babies, from sketch to aquarelle to published page with notes and the black swans and the lone hand. And here we have all of her illustrations of the Gumnut babies and their adventures in Gumnut Town, and the bad Banksia men were always causing mischief. And the little activities these tiny creatures got up to with their bare pink bums and their gum hats, doing things with gum leaves and things just as a child would imagine, playing with leaves and flowers outside. And more sea dragons. I love her color here in this particular painting. How you can see the dragons in the distance, as if you're looking through water. Like how the water changes the colors. Little Obelia, another little water sprite, and goannas, and all the creatures in May's fantasy world of the Australian bush. But her sense of humour always came through as well in her comic strips that she had published. Bib and Bub. Some of them very funny images that we can relate to as humans as well, showing the human psyche, human fallibility, human habits, and allowing us to laugh at ourselves as a human race and re-examine our place in the world and our relationship with it. I hope you are nice and relaxed, my friend, and that you have enjoyed another look at an artist and illustrator that inspires imagination, innovation, and whose creativity and inspiration continues into the present. Have a beautiful, beautiful sleep. Be good to yourself. Be kind to others and to all the creatures, and be extraordinary.